So welcome everybody to our presentation today. My name is Shannon Bryan and I'm a librarian at the Belleville Public Library. And I'm very happy here to continue our partnership with the Hastings County Historical Society. This is our first talk for 2022 and we're quite excited about it. Before I pass this off to Jim, who will introduce our guest speaker today, I just want to go over a few technical things. First of all, we will be recording the webinar. So if you know someone who couldn't attend today, it will be on the Hastings County Historical Society's YouTube page within the next couple of days. The other thing too, if you have any questions or any tech questions, anything like that throughout, please use the chat feature. I'm on a computer screen, so in the bottom, in the middle is the chat feature, and you can message us, and I will be keeping an eye on all the questions for John throughout, and then we'll go through those questions at the end of his presentation. I think that's about it by now, so I'm going to pass this off to Jim, but thank you very much everyone for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Shannon. Well, we'd like to welcome everyone to this joint presentation with the Belleville Public Library. Over the last year, we've been fortunate to work together to provide a series of Zoom presentations that you can find on YouTube that are both informative and engaging, and I think you'll find very thoughtful. We know today's presentation is going to follow in like mode. The Chief Executive Officer and Chair of Osisco Mining, John Burzynski, holds an honors degree in the Bachelor of Science in Geology from Mount Allison and a Master of Science in Exploration and Mineral Economics from Queen's, a registered professional geologist in Quebec. He has a wide experience on national and international mining and development projects. John was one of the three original founders of Osisco Mining, who defined, financed, and built Canada's largest producing gold mine, Canadian Malartic. Among other awards, Mr. Burzynski was co-winner of the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada's Prospector of the Year Award for 2007. The Northern Miners Mining Men of the Year for 2009, and the Association de l'Exploration Minière du Québec Discovery of the Year Award in 2017. John has served on a number of public company boards, and he currently sits as the chairman of O3 Mining Inc., as the director of Osisco Development and Osisco Green Acquisition. He was recently appointed honorary colonel of the Canadian Forces Aerospace Warfare Center in Trenton. Congratulations on that, John. Obviously, John's boots are not collecting dust as he pursues his many endeavors. We welcome him here today to share with us on the search and discovery of the Avro Arrow's free flight models in Lake Ontario. Welcome, John. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jim and Shannon. And welcome everybody to today's presentation. I'm going to dive right into it. Pun intended. The Avro Arrow design studies started back in 1953. The free flight models that were the subject of our search were part of that design work. They were fired from Point Petre in a series of tests from 1954 to 1957. The actual Arrow, the first jet, flew in 1958, and then the program was canceled in the spring of 1959. On what they call Black Friday. All 6 flying planes and all other tooling involved in the plant and plans were destroyed at that time. There were about 15,000 people who worked on the project directly in engineering at Avro, and about another 15,000 by some estimates who worked in ancillary businesses that supplied. So approximately 30,000 Canadians lost their jobs that day when they canceled the program. Which is one of the many reasons why it's a very memorable event to many Canadians, especially in our area of Toronto and Ontario, with the plant having been in Malton and many of the workers and their descendants still living in the immediate area. The program had spent about 400 million Canadian at the time, which is equivalent to a little over $3 billion, which is basically dustbin at the end of the program. Leading to the, what many Canadians consider to be this tragic event with the closure of the program. Our interest in finding these Avro Arrow models was principally because they were some of the only parts of the program that still existed, when they were fired off into the lake between 1954 and 1957, they were essentially left there on the bottom of the lake, and people forgot about them over time. So when the Avro Arrow program proper was canceled, and most of the planes and bits and pieces of that program were destroyed, these were some of the remaining elements of that program that hadn't been. The models themselves were designed to test the airframe of the Avro Arrow while it was in its design stages at Mach speeds. And they had to have a way to do it. So what they did was they strapped them onto booster rockets that brought them up to Mach speed. The model planes separated, and then with telemetry equipment inside the planes was sent back to basically monitor how the wing and other aspects of the test models performed. There have been previous hunts for the Arrow models, and that's actually how it came to our attention as well. As far back as the late 1990s, there were different groups out in the lake searching for them. Many of the groups contained former employees of Avro Arrow or aficionados of the plane. And I think my first experience was watching a news article involving the Navy ships that did an exercise out there in the early 2000s.
John, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm going to just interrupt you for 1 second. There seems to be some gray bars blocking some of the text there. I think it might be on your computer. Do you see them?
Not on my computer, no.
Okay. Not above the title, The Hunt for Avro Arrow? Weird text box?
There is a, Irina, could you just take a look? This, okay. What is this box?
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, there is only a panel, Shannon, that is, no. And
Okay, somebody's saying it's fine. Okay. Sorry about that. I apologize.
No trouble. I got it. Yeah, apologies for anyone who's having trouble viewing this on our screen. It shows, it doesn't show any of that. But in 2004, there wasn't, as one of the searches, there was a Navy search where they covered some of the areas off Point Petre to look for the lost models. And I guess having come across some of the newspaper articles later on, some of us were contemplating what had happened with the discoveries from the Franklin expedition. And it got us thinking about what other iconic Canadian artifacts were still out there remaining to be found, which is how we got involved in the program. You know, the searches had been unsuccessful over time. Some of the rockets had been found, but nobody over the 20 plus years that the searches have been conducted had ever found the Avro models, which led to a lot of theories about why they hadn't, which we'll get to in a minute. As we prepared for our search, one of the first things we had to do was seek licensing from the Ontario government. We applied for permits to search. You need a search permit to go out on the lake and do sonar for anything. And at the same time, we applied for a recovery permit, and in which case you need an archaeologist, you need conservators, and you need agreements with museums for any relics that you do eventually recover. So one of the first things we did was we formed an agreement with the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Canadian Aviation Space Museum, part of the Ingenium museum system, as partners in this search. We got our permits to search and recover, and then we started diving into the old records from the previous searches, and looked in areas that they had searched to have a look at what they had found, and then tried to kind of define where we thought that we might find the models. We engaged as our principal archaeologist over the last 4 years or 5 years, Scarlett Genesis. And we had the great assistance of Dr. Richard Main, who is the Royal Canadian Air Force historian, helping us dig through some of the old and some of the still classified files where much of the information was. Although a lot of the records have been destroyed at the end of the Arrow program, there were some records available, some films from the test flights. And we were trying to piece together as best we could where we thought that these rockets and then the free flight models had come down. Along the way, over the past few years, we've had assistance from the Canadian Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Navy, and some others in terms of providing logistics, such as being able to use their lighthouse base for launching. The Navy came in and did some sonar exercises with us. And when we were doing the recovery in 2018, we had the Atlantic Fleet Dive Unit come and do some of the assistance diving as well. The whole exercise, other than that, was privately funded through various financial groups that we're affiliated with internally within our mining group, some of the other mining companies, and some of the bankers that we use in our regular day mining business. there were a lot of logistics involved. Doing any kind of a search like this involves, first of all, having the people necessary, the archaeologists doing the academic research, but then you need boats and cars and again, places to launch. And then when you have all that together, sometimes you have days that work and sometimes you have days that don't, because a lot of this equipment only works on good days. So it was a large undertaking, and we got ourselves prepared to go out and search the area. Where we started searching was about 100 square kilometer grid. We knew where the test models had been fired from. The actual launch pad is still out there on Point Petre. It's within inside a active military installation. You can see it from the road, but you can't go in without permission. We had records of the general direction that they were fired on. And then from some of the previous work that was done, we had an idea where the booster rockets came off. And really what was left for us to do was try and figure out how far those models had flown. And there wasn't a lot of good information, because while some of the earlier reports on the free flight model testing were available, much of it wasn't. Many of the reports were missing. The available information that was there pertained to flight tests that were done in a Virginia, US installation. So they weren't really that useful to us here, except in a general way in terms of trying to determine what the distance was that they fell. So our initial approach was to outline that whole area and cover it all. So something that we thought would be a relatively short exercise, maybe take us one season, maybe two. It turned out to be more like 4. 100 square kilometers of open water is a big area to search. And one of the main things that kept us moving at a slower pace than we'd hoped initially was that there are so many targets out there. Again, I'll touch on this in a few minutes. But needless to say, since the days, I guess, preceding World War II, that whole southern coast of Prince Edward County had been used as anti-aircraft testing area in terms of firing some of the anti-aircraft guns, artillery testing. There were later after the war, rocket tests and missile tests, both surface to air and air to air. Historically, over the last couple hundred years, this area is one of the main inward and outward bound shipping lanes. So there are shipwrecks out there and pieces of ships. Again, back to World War II, it was a flight test area, so there are plane crashes out there. We expected to find many objects, and there certainly were. So it complicated the search in terms of the number of things that showed up on our sonar that we then had to investigate. Pardon me. The models themselves are about 12 feet long, 15 feet long, and about 10 to 12 feet wide. The Nike booster rockets that carry them are about a similar length, 15 to probably 20 feet long. So you'd think it makes a big target, but it's a pretty tiny piece of metal to be looking for when you separate the 12-foot long by 10-foot plane and dump it in the lake. So before we started, we did a few tests. We were working on the assumption that for what we hoped to find, which was a fully intact late free flight model. The later models were all identical replicas of the original flying Avro Arrow plane. So we built a replica model, the same scale, 2-dimensional, took a boat, went out on the lake, and we dropped it onto the bottom in about 60 or 70 meters of water. And then the first sonar group that we had out there, Kraken, ran their device over it from a bunch of different directions to give us an idea of what the sonar target would look like. You can see in this red circle, there's a shadow. You can see the body of the plane and the tail. Here's a close-up of that in parallel with that model sitting on the grass. It's still a tiny target. And again, we were expecting to find hundreds of targets out there and then be able to hopefully discern the Avro models from the rest of the missiles and rockets and boosters and ship parts and plane parts and snowmobiles and picnic tables and things that have littered the base of the lake over the years. What we found in just that first season were thousands of targets. And over the course of the last 4 years of sonar, many thousands of targets. This was all complicated again by a second degree of mussel coverage. The quagga mussels that are an invasive species in Lake Ontario grow very quickly. Although they were, I'm sure, a great aid over the last couple of decades in clearing up the water. And we did see very clear water when we ran the ROV down there. They blanket everything that's on the lake bottom with a thick cover of mussels. This is an example from Lake Mead in Nevada. over just 6 months, the muscle coverage that occurred on an outflow pipe. Very similar situation in Lake Ontario in terms of the muscle growth on any object that sits on the floor with a positive relief. This map shows the principal targets, and not all sonar targets, but just the principal targets, things that were cultural targets, things that we knew weren't just rocks in that first year of survey. And you can see the many blue dots. And trying to figure out where to start in all of this involved then looking at the relative sonar images, trying to find things that looked like what we were looking for, and then ultimately bringing an ROV in to take a look at them. This next slide shows some of the photographs or I guess sonar images of what we saw on the bottom of the lake. The bottom left is one of the Nike rocket boosters. You can see the tail wing. The shadow is another piece of the wing standing upright, which causes the sonar shadow. The very distinct nozzle on the lower part of that image. The image in the middle is, we believe, one of the Velvet Glove rockets that were designed as part of the Avro program. The actual Velvet Glove program was canceled before they got into designing and building the actual jet. And on the lower right is a ship rudder, a very large structure. At first, when we found this, an image that we sent down the ROV and we looked at it, initially we thought it might be a wing from one of the Nike rockets, but the entire thing is made out of wood. The upper right is a schooner that was identified by a previous search group. This is an image from the Royal Canadian Navy search in 2004, and possibly even the rudder comes from that ship. Some of the first sightings and things that got us excited early in the summer of 2017 when we started our search were parts of the Nike rockets. What we were trying to do, and we assumed that we would find the rockets first closest to shore, because the rockets went up and separated with the actual flying models. But to find those rockets would give us a vector to where we could expect to find those planes downrange. Some photographs here on the left showing one of the housings and fins from one of the Nike rockets. The two sonar images on the bottom in brown are the bodies of those, the body components of the Nike rockets. And on the upper right shows that back very distinctive nozzle that's part of the Nike rocket. I'm quite certain that in our search over the last 4 years, we've defined the locations of all of the rockets that were used to boost the free flight models out over the lake. And then our job then was to follow those trajectories downrange into the lake to try and find the models themselves. This next slide with the red dots shows the locations of those Nike booster rockets. And you can see you can draw a nice straight line pretty much through that, which correlated well with historically what we thought the direction of firing was. The little blue star in the middle of that circle is where we found the first model that I'm going to talk about on this next slide. Late in September of 2017, we imaged our first model. On the left is the sonar image, and on the right is the first ROV camera image that we had of it. We planned the recovery over 2018, again with our archaeologist Scarlett Genesis and Dr. Richard Main. Got together with some diving assistants from the Atlantic Fleet Dive Unit, some commercial divers. The Canada Conservation Institute came and sat on the boat with us during the recovery and took charge of the model once we found it. We had volunteers, a lift ship, and CFB Trenton was very gracious in letting us land the first artifact at the base there where the initial conservation work was done. This slide shows some of the slides from the recovery in 2018. On the upper left is the Fleet Dive Unit team getting prepared to go out and do some of the work on the recovery. On the lower left, you can see the model has been put into the recovery cradle. In the middle is the recovery cradle coming to surface. And on the right is the Canada Conservation Institute team doing the initial recovery and cleaning work on the Delta test vehicle. Back to the quagga mussels. When it came up, it looked very different from how it looks in these photographs here. They removed something like 15 kilograms of mussels from the upper surface of the model. All this work was done in preparation for then shipping it to Ottawa for further conservation work and then eventual transport to the Canada Aviation Space Museum. We discovered one of the first models. The DTVs or Delta test vehicles were some of the first in the series of the free flight models that were fired off to do the design test work, to test the separation of the models from the rockets, to test the telemetry equipment. This one as well had some very detailed telemetric devices inside the main body of the model. On this next slide, we can see Aaron Gregory from the Canada Aviation Space Museum looking at the first removal of some of those devices from the interior body. On the bottom is an X-ray of the free flight model Delta test vehicle before they started taking the mechanics out of it. Again, this work was done initially at Trenton, then at CCI in Ottawa, and then later on the final work was done at the Canada Aviation Space Museum. This model is now on display. It was put on display in the summer of 2019 on Canada Day. It will be part of a larger Cold War exhibit that they're planning to open in 2024 as well. So, you know, we were successful in that first part of the survey, but still looking for the rest of the free flight models. Just a quick factoid, this particular model, we found records indicating that it cost about $100,000 to build back in 1954. In today's dollars, that's about $1 million equivalent. So, you know, a valuable piece of Canadian aviation history. And certainly from a dollar sense, I'd love to find more of these. The free flight instrumentation for the final models, the instrumentation was done and put together in the main offices of Avro Arrow up in Malton, and then they were transported down to Point Petre for firing. But on the right, you can see a list of the type of instrumentation that they put inside the free flight models: boost accelerators, drag accelerators. They were looking at pitch, separation, yaw, roll. A lot of information was intended to be collected from these models that they would then use when they were designing the final aspects of the Avro Arrow. The models were important because they didn't have computers like today, and they didn't have wind tunnels big enough to do accurate tests at Mach speed to see whether the wing design would hold up under those stresses. So the best way that they could do it was to put them on a smaller scale, and these were 1/8 scale, onto these rockets, which then brought them up to Mach speed, and then do these tests to see that everything held together. They were important in that aspect of the final build of the Avro Arrow. In 2020, we went out to look at the final portion of the search grid that we hadn't covered. These are the late models were numbers 8, 9, 10, and 11. These were exact replicas of the Avro Arrow, and these were really the things that we'd set out at the beginning of the search to try and find. We were very pleased with the discovery of the initial Delta test vehicle, but really what we and all of the other searchers over time, the last 20 plus years, have been searching for are those final models because of their exact likeness of the Avro Arrow. On the upper right, you can see the regions that we had covered in sonar in 2017, 18, and 19 in brown. We decided in 2019 to go deeper in the lake based on what we thought the separation from the boosters and the likely landing area would be. And then we left that one small block outlined in blue there, which became our 2020 search area, which it looks a lot like this. We were back to open water. We had found the boosters. We were starting to get into areas where we were seeing fewer and fewer cultural artifacts. And a daunting task, again, of going out into deeper water and hoping to find one of the intact models. We engaged a company called ASI. This is the ASI Clipper, which it's kind of funny. It had been used on one of the earlier expeditions back in 2003, Mike Fletcher's Sea Hunter series, in conjunction with National Geographic. Went out there in search of the models, and they imaged some of the booster rockets for some of the missile programs. Didn't have any luck in finding the Avro Arrow free flight models that time, but their luck was about to change with our group. Another interesting aspect about this, and this is probably the first time I've talked about this publicly in a presentation I've given, while we were preparing to finish our search for the Avro Arrow free flight models, we came across some of Carmen Johnson's family members who still live out near Wapoos. There's the Johnson RV park. And they shared with us some of the information and memorabilia that he'd collected over the years. He's passed on now. But he was quoted in the Kingston newspaper while the 2004 Navy search was going on with a very apt comment that none of them are looking in the right place. Carmen was the cameraman of station number 4, which is one of the camera stations back in the 1950s, where they did the filming of the tests for part of their record and archive, and to study after the flight and look at the flight dynamics of the free flight models. And he's quoted in this newspaper article as saying, from his perspective at that station, none of the free flight models had ever gone past his station. Some of the previous searches had looked much deeper out in the lake or much closer to shore. And it's a very interesting article if anyone ever wants to go back and look in the old archives and read it, because he quite aptly notes that they all came down in about the same area, and they were all falling into the lake before they passed his camera station. Back to our search in 2020, we were looking at that final grid. It was the only place that we really hadn't searched that was on the flight line, the separation line from the Nike booster rockets and the deeper water. In the middle is a picture of me standing on flight station number 4, or camera station number 4. It's still there out on the coast of the southern part of Prince Edward County. And you can see where our search grid sits in the blue triangle, or blue rectangle, I guess. And then the yellow circle is where the Nike booster rockets all fell. And that distance between the two is about what we had calculated as should be sort of the average potential distance that they traveled after separation. Carmen's line of sight, if you were standing on that camera station looking straight out into the lake, which we did as an exercise, intersects back out over here on the far right hand side. So it gave us a lot of encouragement that finally in this 4th year of the search that we were probably in the right place where we were going to start seeing the free flight models. Another map showing all of these things combined. The Nike booster rocket field was really an important part of this as well. Having them as a vector put us into that proper area. The historical perspectives of Carmen Johnson. And we had some help from some other members who had worked on the team at the time, and in terms of doing calculations as to what they thought that the glide distance of the free flight models would have been. This next diagram shows the construction of the free flight models. Early on, back when we started the search in 2017, we had strongly considered the fact that when they hit the water, they may have broken up into pieces or disintegrated, because there had been a number of other searches, including Navy sonar teams and the 3 or 4 other groups that had done a lot of coverage. And the fact that nobody had found them started to make us wonder, perhaps was there something that had happened to them? Maybe they broke up. In this diagram, you can see there are really only 3 large pieces to the way the models were constructed. The largest piece is the wing. In the middle, the second largest piece is that tail fin, and the third largest piece is the front lower fuselage. The rest of those pieces are all quite small, and most of them are flat. So if it had broken up on impact with the water and they were still doing 400 to 500 miles an hour when they hit the water, those pieces would have floated down, laid flat on the bottom of the lake, and through time been covered with sediment, and then eventually with mussels. Greatly complicating finding one of the models. And we considered that might be why none of them had ever been found. There were some other interesting theories. Some of the earlier searches had found long furrows on the bottom of the lake, and people had hypothesized that they may have been going so fast that they drove themselves deep into the mud. Not in 150 feet of water, not likely. One of my favorite theories was that the Russians had snuck into the lake with submarines in the 1950s and recovered the models. Seems like it's always the Russians. But we didn't put a lot of weight to that theory. Our feeling was that perhaps that they had broken up, or that they were just in areas that had not been covered. When we looked at the film footage that was collected at the time of the free flight tests, it showed that a lot of the models seemed to have gone off track. Later on, we realized that these were just part of the planned maneuvers, and that they still generally fell somewhere very close to and within that line of fire that we were following from the beginning of the program. The first discovery of one of the late free flight models was made in September of 2020. And as much as we were hoping to find a fully intact free flight model, what we found were pieces. We found one of the front fuselage component. This is that third largest piece. We got in close and had a look at it. You can still see the yellow paint in that little box down in the center of this slide. We found cabling, some other pieces that look like they may be part of the intakes on the side of the models. Some very square pieces that may be the battery and the electronics components. And so, you know, it confirmed to us that at least in the case of this model, and we know that this is one of the last four because only the last four free flight models, these were the identical models that were modeled after the Avro Arrow. Those were the only ones that were yellow in their paint scheme. The rest of them were black and red and other colors. So we'd found the front fuselage and some of the other components. Again, this was a debris field. Our feeling at the time, having looked at it, was that, you know, very likely the other models, when they hit the water at those speeds, would have, in a similar fashion, broken up. It's a distinct piece of the free flight model. It's one of the only pieces that wasn't flat, and it's probably the only reason that we found it. You know, anything with a positive profile will show up on sonar. So our chances of finding the other flat pieces, if they'd all come apart at the seams and at the welds, would have been very low. So it explains why we found this fuselage piece first. And again, here's another view of the construction. You can see on the right, this is a still shot from one of the films from Avro Arrow of the construction of the free flight models. And on the left, you can see that's the piece that housed with the covering off a lot of the electronics, which we found pieces of around this front fuselage piece. So the free flight models, as a progressive series, were shot between 1954 and 57. Our discoveries over the past 4 years or 5 years really bookended the program. We found one of the first vehicles fired off in 1954, and we found one of the last pieces of one of the last models that was fired off in 1957, just prior to the completion of the work and the building, the rollout, and the flight of the first Avro Arrow. We still haven't seen any of the crewed free flight models out there. And out of the approximately 12 models in total that were fired out there as part of this program, we found one intact and pieces of another. So there are 9 others out there somewhere, most likely in pieces on the bottom of the lake. But you know, what we found here are parts of the start and the finish of that program. So as a summary, while we found that first model intact, it gave us big hopes of finding one of those last models also intact, but ultimately it wasn't to be. We found the resting place of one of those last models in pieces, basically bringing to an end 20 years of search by different groups to find the free flight test models on the bottom of Lake Ontario. The early model was raised in 2018. It's part of the Canada Aviation Space Museum collection now. We are still thinking about those pieces on the bottom, and if there's any way to try and locate the other flatter pieces that are now covered in mussels as a way to perhaps do a little bit more tight work and see if we can't bring up one of the late models as well. The sonar coverage of the area basically didn't present any other targets, and this is almost 100 square kilometers of sonar work. So, you know, in our minds, there isn't another intact late free flight model out there. The fact that they picked up the pieces of the fuselage, which are only 1.2 meters long by 30 meters wide, covered in silt and covered in mussels, is really a significant achievement itself by the sonar teams within that 100 square kilometer area. This last slide is a very famous photograph, and it kind of underscores the way a lot of Canadians think about the Avro Arrow program, its demise on Black Friday, the eventual destruction of the planes, and, you know, basically what was a bad day in decision making in Canadian history in terms of how to end a program. I prefer to think of the Avro Arrow program in a different light. After 5 years and taking an idea from concept to free flight, an interceptor that flew and did the things it was supposed to do, the proud work of these 30,000 men and women and their achievement after 5 years is really the story of the Avro Arrow to me. This was a fantastic and very quickly done objective, and it shows you what when a group of people get together can do as a team, and the magnificent end product that was the Avro Arrow, again, to me, is an achievement and not a tragic story at the end of the day. I'd like to thank our sponsors, our partners in this, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Canadian Aviation Space Museum, my own Osisko Mining Group partners for helping fund this, as well as some of our banking partners, Pear Tree Securities, Canaccord, Aid Capital, Maxit, the Bank of Montreal, National Bank, and others, as well as the Canada Conservation Institute, Royal Canadian Navy, the Coast Guard, Ontario Ministry of Tourism and Culture, and our many other partners, contractors, Scarlet Genesis, especially Dr. Richard Main, and our sonar operators and teams for participating in the project and helping us achieve finding and raising the Arrow. At this point, I'll turn it, Jim, over to questions.
Okay, thanks very much, John. That was awesome. So now's the time. If anyone has any questions, they can use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. And we actually have a couple here ready to go. So the first question that I see is from Derek. And it says, are there any serial numbers or markings on the pieces of the FMM that you found that would identify which one it was, 9, 10, 11?
Yeah, the closest we can get to identifying which one it was is that it was either 8, 9, 10, or 11. Again, if you go back to what existing records are of the free flight model series, we know that this was one of the detailed models because they were the only ones that had that fuselage configuration. We have the plans for how the last 4 were built. And again, we know it was one of the last 4. I think there was another one, a 5th, that was fired before 2 were fired into the waters off Virginia, but they were a different color scheme. So this was a yellow one, so it had to be one of the last 4, and that's as close as we can determine, without lifting the pieces, of course.
Okay, well, our next question is from Elizabeth, and she asks, did you ever meet Jan Zurakowski?
I didn't, unfortunately. It would have been a really interesting thing. For those who don't know it, he was a Polish fighter pilot who went over to Britain when the war broke out, and he helped in the Battle of Britain, and then eventually ended up in Canada as the test pilot and the first pilot to fly RL 101 or 201. He eventually settled north of Toronto here and passed away a number of years ago. But my father, I'm Polish, obviously, with a name like Burzynski. I can't claim a deep county history just yet. But my father also served in the Second World War and then came to Canada afterwards. So that there's a bit of a symmetry to my story in that sense, and my interest in his personal history with the Arrow.
Our next question is from Terry, and he asks, did you work with Steve James, Arrow 206?
No, I did not. And I'm not sure I'm familiar with that. Is that the model which is on?
He hasn't replied to that yet, so we'll give him a minute.
Yeah.
Another question is from Alex, and why did you get started with this project?
Again, we were looking, we started the project the same time that they discovered the second Franklin ship. And, there was a lot of news about the Franklin expeditions, and I was just having a sort of an evening conversation with a couple of friends of mine, and we were talking about the fact that they'd found the second one. And literally, we kind of got on the theme of, thinking about what else was out there historically that had been lost somewhere in Canadian history and was still waiting to be found. I'm an explorer by profession. My professional job is to go out and find gold mines. And so I guess in my spare time, I gravitate to doing exactly what I do in my work days, and that's go out and find things. So it was, a little bit of urban exploration, really, because, this project, I have a place out in Prince Edward County. I live here in Toronto. It's about an hour and a half away. So it was a little bit like doing urban Jacques Cousteau type things. So there's an awful lot of history. This won't be news to anybody from the county or Belleville or Hastings, but there's an awful lot of history in the area that people are unaware of. That whole southern part of Prince Edward County is a fascinating area. They did the free flight tests from Point Petre. There's actually a steel post stuck in the ground not far away with a ring around it. You can see it on Google Maps, where they attached a chain and some of the motors, the engines that they were going to put in the plane, and ran them around in circles and circles to basically test fire the engines. And you can still see the ring on the Google photos. This was an anti-aircraft and artillery testing area. Lots of people running around there pre-war, post-war. And a lot of the work that was done just prior to the free flight model tests of the Arrow, they were testing missiles, the Velvet Glove missiles and other types of missiles. And, so I have pictures in my mind of all these, mad scientists running around in white lab coats, shooting rockets out into the lake, trying not to hit ships or, shooting too far over the US. It would have been a really neat time to have been around there. All of it would have been, really secret or classified work. But sort of a fascinating evolution of things that were happening out there on the point. And today, if you drive by, it's a series of fields and there's some radio towers, and you wouldn't suspect what an active place that it was at one time.
Our next question was, what depth was the FFM found? Yeah,
it was found sort of between 100 and 150 feet of water. It's well out offshore. It's a good 10 kilometers offshore. We'd had hopes at the beginning of the program that it might be closer to shore, and really finding that first one, the Delta test vehicle, that was one of the first part of the series, was a bit of a red herring. And it confused us a lot because it was found within the booster field. And by rights, it should have been much further out in the lake. Until after we discovered and recovered it, we found some more records. And this was really work by Dr. Richard Main at the RAF. Or RCAF, where he dug up some reports saying that there were 3 of them. They were fired out there, but one of them was not fired off on a booster rocket. It just used the internal rocket. They had a booster, and then on separation, they had another internal rocket. But they wanted to see just how far the internal rocket alone would carry one, which is why it landed right in the middle of the booster field.
Okay.
Yeah.
So going back to the original question from Terry, who asked, did you work with Steve James? He further said, the Arrow 206 project got some local mention and is creating a museum north of Toronto.
Yeah, well, there were a group of enthusiasts here in Toronto, and there was a museum dedicated to a lot of, aviation history, and a lot of the Arrow artifacts ended up there, where they built a scale model of the Arrow that had sat for a long time up at the airport, Pearson, in one of the commercial areas just under cover. And I think a couple of years ago, they moved that up to another local museum further north of Toronto. While I've met the people involved, I can't say we've done a lot of work with them, though.
Okay. So Paul had this. Have you ever asked the local divers in the area that have extensive knowledge? From the chats I've had with them, they tell me they've seen and photographed a bunch of items. I saw a picture of a velvet glove booster. So there may be some truth to their information.
No, certainly. Again, back to what we imaged over the course of doing sonar surveys between 2017 and 2020, we literally imaged thousands of objects, many missiles, many booster rockets, ship parts, plane parts, the free flight models, tree stumps, probably from pre-glacial days, old tires, things that have fallen off the ships, shipwrecks. There are thousands and thousands of things out there. Many of them are very difficult to tell apart from, a rock. We did our best we could to sort through the many targets we had to try and identify which were cultural and which weren't. And then the job was to send an ROV down to further try and weed out which ones were part of the Avro program and which ones weren't. But certainly we have seen a number of Velvet Glove rockets and their boosters out on the bottom of the lake.
Orland just has a comment. He says he's actually met Jan Zurkowski at his resort near Barry's Bay. So
nice.
Well done, Orland.
I'll add something I almost forgot. There's a young lady that we know who lived across the street from him and grew up with his sons, which again was sort of a happenstance story. But I know somebody who knew him anyway. So.
Derek asks you, what's next in regards to this project? Will you be continuing to search and recover items?
Yeah, and that's a good question. Really, I think we've answered the question that was out there since groups started to go search for these models. What happened to them? Some of the theories, again, because of the way they were constructed of the last ones anyway, of a magnesium titanium alloy. Magnesium is infamous for bursting into flames in either air or water. But it was part of the problem that was solved for the actual Avro Arrow itself, because they were constructed of the same material. Inco, another Canadian mining company, helped develop the alloy. It's a lightweight alloy. So some people had thought that maybe over time in the water column that the planes had actually dissolved. There was the Russian theory, which we discounted. We were concerned that perhaps, because each of the models weighed something over 500 pounds, that in deeper water where there was no rock, they may have settled into the sediment or been washed over with sediment and time. And then if the mussel blankets covered them, we wouldn't see them. What we were still seeing out there in 100, 150 foot water was that any pieces that were on the bottom weren't particularly deeply embedded in the sediment. So, we give me hope that the other ones, they're there to be found, but you have to be doing very tight, very precise sonar to find something that's less than a meter square. Most sonar is not geared to finding targets that small, and it's an expensive undertaking to go out and look for small parts. We were hoping to find basically a 10 foot by 10 foot model, and that was pushing the limits as it was. So whether we do more or not, we may do some more work around the pieces that we found, just to see if we can't locate and identify the other pieces, and then we might consider raising those. But as far as going out and doing a lot of additional sonar to identify the other 8 or 9 models that we hadn't imaged through this program, and who knows, maybe we have, they're just covered in mussels and we haven't identified them yet within our data. I don't think we'll be doing additional surveys for the additional models.
Okay. Linda says her father, Harry Ballantyne, worked on the project. Last year, she reached out to Fred Wildeman, archivist at the Avro Museum. Have you been in contact with this organization to add or share your info?
I haven't, but over the course of the program, when we launched it back in 2017, up until we completed it really last year, we've had many requests by different newspapers, radio shows, interviews. We've been approached by people who worked on the program. We had one gentleman working with us who was actually the photographer for Avro. If you've ever seen live video or pictures of the Avro Arrow in flight, he probably took them. We met a number of the people who worked out at Point Petre when they did the launches. And we met the sons and daughters and relatives of many people who worked on the program. Because there were so many people involved in the construction and the supply and design and construction of the planes, there are a heck of a lot of people around who have firsthand knowledge or family knowledge. We had people coming up to us when we were launching the sonar boats with top secret reports, interim reports with pieces of the motors, with bits and pieces of the plane. We met a gentleman at an event that we held here in Toronto, who, as a boy, used to play in a particular junkyard in Hamilton. And he and his brother would sneak under the fence and drag bits and pieces home. And one day they found a whole bunch of shiny new stuff there, and so he dragged a whole bunch home. About 20 years later, he was watching television and was watching a story on the Avro Arrow, and the light bulb went off. And so he asked his mother what happened to all that stuff he had as a kid. He went out to the garage, and they all turned out to be pieces of instrumentation from the different flying planes, because the junkyard was the one where they sent all of the scrap metal. And so he had dials and ejector things, and they all had serial numbers from, this is RL201, or this is RL204. And he had a big chest of pieces of the melted down arrow from where they blowtorched them. This junkyard was the final resting place of the Avro Arrows, where they were basically turned into scrap metal. And as I have a piece that I received from him. This is a piece of one of the Avro Arrow planes. It's basically all that's left were little bits and pieces. There is a nose cone in the Canada Aviation Space Museum, an ejector seat or two, one or two Arenda engines and some wingtips, but really that's about it. So, part of our motivation for going out and looking for the free flight models was these, again, are some of the few remaining pieces of that program, because they were so so intent on erasing it at the end of the program when they destroyed all the planes and basically burnt the plans and took apart the tooling plans. Yeah.
So this is from Irene. She says, we ride amphibious vehicles, Argos, at Point Petre and found the circle you mentioned where they slingshot the models. We couldn't figure out why there was this strange flat circle in the middle of the woods.
Yeah.
Such fascinating history, great presentation. Would love to see a plaque or something to mark the history on that circle of land. Is this possible?
Yeah, well, good question. And again, they were testing the engines. That ring was, I think it's called the Orenda ring. And just historically, the last flying Avro Arrows were destroyed before they were ever paired with the engine that was also being developed for the plane. It was a very ambitious program, the Arrow program. They were developing a rocket or a missile system, which was the Velvet Glove system. They were developing the actual flying jet, and they were developing a new engine at the same time. The Iroquois engine never got into the Avro Arrow before they canceled the program, but they had tested it. And so what they did was they basically chained those engines up on carts with wheels and had them race around the ring. In terms of a plaque out there, interesting idea, and I think one for the local historical societies to consider.
Okay, Ed says the Avro full-size replica is at Erinvale near
Yes.
Barrie. Yeah.
Worth a visit for anybody who wants to go see it. It is. I've seen it, from a parking lot looking into the airfield where it was sitting, and it's pretty neat.
Rick is asking, isn't there a statue in Barry's Bay?
I think there is a statue of Yan in Barry's Bay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Ingrid wants to know, are there any dangerous items or elements still underwater?
Oh God, I'm sure there are. Yeah, look, I suspect most of the surface to air and air to air missile testing that was done out there was done with non-explosive tips on things. There were some planes that crashed out there, some CF-100s, some other planes during World War II. I'm sure there are live rounds washing around on the bottom of Lake Ontario in lots of different places, because as many local residents will know, there were many places that were used for either artillery testing or bombing testing. One of the folks that we talked to over the years gave us a recollection of some of the young training flyers who would go out there, and during the week they probably fly Monday to Friday and do bombing tests out in the water and stuff. And some of them, because they wanted to get off early Friday night and go out to the dances, would drop their bombs a little early, and they all ended up in a field. And there was a local fellow who used to go out and collect the scrap metal. And so one day, this fellow who was recounting the story said, can you take me out and show me where you're finding all the scrap metal? And he said, oh yeah, sure. And they walked out there and says, well, how are we going to find them? And he just walked around with a stick and started poking it into the ground. these bomb fragments, which is an interesting way to do it, but you wouldn't want to find one of them that was intact. But I guess it was a pretty profitable business at the time.
And a final question so far from Paul. What is the biggest surprise you have found about this whole hunt that shocked you?
I guess the surprise was in the first year, we knew there'd be public attention on the search. Which we didn't discourage, because again, we had sponsors and we wanted to bring the story of the Arrow back to the forefront, and Raise the Arrow is really about raising the profile of the work that was done by these 30,000 men and women in designing and realizing the flight of the Avro Arrow, besides going out and raising the models. But the big surprise to us was just how much interest there was. The Avro Arrow is iconic, but it's iconic. We had something north of 200 million imprints. We have a media company that we use as a mining company, and they were keeping track of this for us. And we, in the first month or two of the search program in 2017, they had over 200 million impressions with radio and internet and television and newspapers and magazines. And we had the BBC asking for interviews. We were in Russian newspapers. We had the New York Times send somebody up. Besides all of the major Canadian networks and news stations. So it was very surprising to us just what the level of interest was.
Okay. I'm just going to give a few seconds here. If there's any more questions, you can use the chat feature. at the bottom of your screen, most likely. All right, just give people a few minutes. Thank you very much, John, for that presentation and for answering all those questions too. That was great that they came in.
No, my pleasure. And I've got one extra for you.
Oh.
We designed some, T-shirts and things that we had during the program, because we did a lot of public speaking and gave them out. So I have some very fine Avro Arrow actual OEX expedition wear T-shirts to give out, I guess, to the first 50 people who email you about that. If they send the email to the library, we'll make sure we get the T-shirts out to them.
Okay, awesome.
If they want to send in an address, we'll make sure you get a T-shirt if you're interested.
Awesome. Okay, you guys can email me, okay?
Yeah.
I'm gonna get flooded with emails now.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman here, Chris, commercial diver here. Do you need any more help underwater?
Maybe if you want to send the email on to Shannon, and maybe she can forward it to me. And
I'm going to put my email actually in the chat. And if you want a link to the recording, if you can't find their page, the YouTube page, I can send that to you as well. Just gonna, that's my email address. So if you have any questions, if you want to win a T-shirt as well. And John here, another John, he said, great presentation. My father worked on the project as a draftsman. I still have his Avro Flying Club membership card.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. So I'm going to pass this. Oh, sorry, one more. Oh, raisethearrow.ca is a website as well.
Yeah. Well,
all right.
Sorry, I was just going to say we have I think we had a web page which we let lapse because we transferred the photo files and things from what we were doing onto our mining company website. So if people want to find it, there's a section on the Avro Arrow at osiscomining.com. Okay,
awesome. I'm going to pass this on to Jim, but thank you again, John. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Shannon. John, your presentation provided us with a comprehensive, careful approach to the research you conducted. We are privileged to have shared in your meticulous planning and the resulting discoveries. Thank you for sharing your passion for the Avro Arrow and your contribution to our understanding of this important part in Canadian history. And for our viewership, if you know of somebody who would be interested in this presentation, remember that this will be on YouTube, so pass that information on to them. And I just want to make one mention that next month we are going to have Barry Wilson speaking about Sir Mackenzie Bowell. He has come out with a new book on one of Belleville's favorite sons, and who was the Canadian Prime Minister. So thank you very much, John. And
thank you, Shannon.
Good. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors.